conclusion. I was interested in learning what this man thought because I knew that he was one of ADC's ace radar troubleshooters, and that he traveled all over the world, on loan from ADC, to work out problems with radars. From the description of what the targets looked like on the radar scopes, good, strong, bright images, I can't believe that they were caused by weather, he told me. Then he went on to back up his argument by pointing out that when the ground radar was switched to short range, both the F-94 and the unknown target disappeared. If just the unknown target had disappeared, then it could have been weather. But since both disappeared, very probably the radar set wasn't working on short ranges for some reason. Next, he pointed out that if there was a temperature inversion, which is highly unlikely in northern Alaska, the same inversion that would affect the ground radar wouldn't be present at 25,000 feet or above. I told him about the report from Oak Ridge that Captain James had used as an example, but he didn't buy this comparison. At Oak Ridge, he pointed out, that F-82 was at only 4,000 feet. He didn't know how the F-94s could get to within 200 yards of an object without seeing it, unless the object was painted a dull black. No, he said, I can't believe that those radar targets were caused by weather. I'd be much more inclined to believe that they were something real, something that we just don't know about. During the early spring of 1952, reports of radar sightings increased rapidly. Most of them came from the Air Defense Command, but a few came from other agencies. One day, soon after the Alaskan incident, I got a telephone call from the chief of one of the sections of a civilian experimental radar laboratory in New York State. The people in this lab were working on the development of the latest types of radar. Several times recently, while testing radars, they had detected unidentified targets. To quote my caller, "Some damn odd things are happening that are beginning to worry me." He went on to tell how the people in his lab had checked their radars, the weather, and everything else they could think of, but they could find absolutely nothing to account for the targets. They could only conclude that they were real. I promised him that his information would get to the right people if he'd put it in a letter and send it to ATIC. In about a week, the letter arrived, hand-carried by no less than a general. The general, who was from Headquarters Air Materiel Command, had been in New York at the radar laboratory, and he had heard about the UFO reports. He had personally checked into them because he knew that the people at the lab were some of the sharpest radar engineers in the world. When he found out that these people had already contacted us and had prepared a report for us, he offered to hand carry it to Wright-Patterson. I can't divulge how high these targets were flying or how fast they were going, because it would give an indication of the performance of our latest radar, which is classified secret. I can say, however, that they were flying mighty high and mighty fast. I turned the letter over to ATIC's electronics branch, and they promised to take immediate action. They did, and really fouled it up. The person who received the report in the electronics branch was one of the old veterans of Projects Sign and Grudge. He knew all about UFOs. He got on the phone, called the radar lab, and told the chief, a man who possibly wrote all of the textbooks this person had used in college, all about how a weather inversion can cause false targets on weather. He was gracious enough to tell the chief of the radar lab to call if he had any more trouble. We never heard from them again. Maybe they found out what their targets were. Or maybe they joined ranks with the airline pilot who told me that if a flying saucer flew wingtip to wingtip formation with him, he'd never tell the Air Force. In early February, I made another trip to Air Defense Command headquarters in Colorado Springs. This time it was to present a definite plan of how ADC could assist ATIC in getting better data on UFOs. I briefed General Benjamin W. Chidlaw, then the Commanding General of the Air Defense Command, and his staff, telling them about our plan. They agreed with it in principle and suggested that I work out the details with the Director of Intelligence for ADC, Brigadier General Burgess designated Major Vern Sadowski of his staff to be the ADC liaison officer with Project Grudge. This briefing started a long period of close cooperation between Project Grudge and ADC, and it was a pleasure to work with these people. In all of my travels around the government, visiting and conferring with dozens of agencies, I never had the pleasure of working with or seeing a more smoothly operating and efficient organization than the Air Defense Command. General Chidlaw and General Burgess, along with the rest of the staff at ADC, were truly great officers. None of them were believers in flying saucers, but they recognized the fact that UFO reports were a problem that must be considered. With technological progress what it is today, you can't afford to have anything in the air that you can't identify, be it balloons, meteors, planets, or flying saucers. The plan that ADC agreed to was very simple. They agreed to issue a directive to all of their units explaining the UFO situation and telling specifically what to do in case one was detected. All radar units equipped with radar scope cameras would be required to take scope photos of targets that fell into the UFO category, targets that were not airplanes or known weather phenomena. These photos, along with a completed technical questionnaire that would be made up at ATIC by Captain Roy James, would be forwarded to Project Grudge. The Air Defense Command UFO Directive would also clarify the scrambling of fighters to intercept a UFO. Since it is the policy of the Air Defense Command to establish the identity of any unidentified target, there were no special orders issued for scrambling fighters to try to identify reported UFOs. A UFO was something unknown and automatically called for a scramble. However, there had been some hesitancy on the part of controllers to send airplanes up whenever radar picked up a target that obviously was not an airplane. The directive merely pointed out to the controllers that it was within the scope of existing regulations to scramble on radar targets that were plotted as traveling too fast or too slow to be conventional airplanes. The decision to scramble fighters was still up to the individual controller, however, and scrambling on UFOs would be a second or third priority. The Air Defense Command UFO Directive did not mention shooting at a UFO. This question came up during our planning meeting at Colorado Springs, but like the authority to scramble, the authority to shoot at anything in the air had been established long ago. Every ADC pilot knows the rules for engagement, the rules that tell him when he can shoot the loaded guns that he always carries. If anything in the air over the United States commits any act that is covered by the rules for engagement, the pilot has the authority to open fire. The third thing that ADC would do would be to integrate the Ground Observer Corps into the UFO reporting net. As a second priority, the GOC would report UFOs. First priority would still be reporting aircraft. Ever since the new Project Grudge had been organized, we hadn't had to deal with any large-scale publicity about UFOs. Occasionally someone would bring in a local item from some newspaper about a UFO sighting, but the sightings never rated more than an inch or two column space. But on February 19, 1952, the calm was broken by the story of how a huge ball of fire paced two B-29s in Korea. The story didn't start a rash of reports, as the story of the first UFO sighting did in June 1947. but it was significant in that it started a slow buildup of publicity that was far to surpass anything in the past. This Korean sighting also added to the growing official interest in Washington. Almost every day I was getting 1 or 2 telephone calls from some branch of the government, and I was going to Washington at least once every 2 weeks. I was beginning to spend as much time telling people what was going on as I was doing anything about it. The answer was to get somebody in the Directorate of Intelligence in the Pentagon to act as a liaison officer. I could keep this person informed, and he could handle the branch office in Washington. Colonel Dunn bought this idea, and Major Dewey J. Fournay got the additional duty of manager of the Pentagon branch. In the future, all Pentagon inquiries went to Major Fournay, and if he couldn't answer them, he would call me. The arrangement was excellent because Major Fournay took a very serious interest in UFOs and could always be counted on to do a good job. Sometime in February 1952, I had a visit from 2 Royal Canadian Air Force officers. For some time, I learned, Canada had been getting her share of UFO reports. One of the latest ones, and the one that prompted the visit by the RCAF officers, occurred at North Bay, Ontario, about 250 miles north of Buffalo, New York. On 2 occasions, an orange-red disc had been seen from a new jet fighter base in the area. The Canadians wanted to know how we operated. I gave them the details of how we were currently operating and how we hoped to operate in the future, as soon as the procedures that were now in the planning stages could be put into operation. We agreed to try to set up channels so that we could exchange information and tie in the project they planned to establish with Project Grudge. Our plans for continuing liaison didn't materialize, but through other RCAF intelligence officers, I found out that their plans for an RCAF-sponsored project failed, and its objective was to use instruments to detect objects coming into the Earth's atmosphere. In 1954, the project was closed down because during the 2 years of operation, they hadn't officially detected any UFOs. My sources of information stressed the word officially. During the time that I was chief of the UFO project, the visitors who passed through my office closely resembled the International Brigade. Most of the visits were unofficial in the sense that the officers came to ATIC on other business, but in many instances, the other business was just an excuse to come out to Dayton to get filled in on the UFO story. 2 RAF intelligence officers who were in the U.S. on a classified mission brought 6 single-spaced type pages of questions they and their friends wanted answered. On many occasions, Air Force intelligence officers who were stationed in England, France, and Germany, and who returned to the U.S. on business, took back stacks of unclassified flying saucer stories. One civilian intelligence agent, who frequently traveled between the U.S. and Europe, also acted as the unofficial courier for a German group, transporting hot newspaper and magazine articles about UFOs that I'd collected. In return, I received the latest information on European sightings,